Thank you, Dan, and thank you all of you for coming. This is a really exciting time in the world of health law and policy. And so what I'm going to do today is just tell you a little bit of the highlights of this case from a health law and policy angle. So as David told you, the major two findings from this case are that the individual mandate was upheld and that the Medicaid expansion provisions were limited in that it would be constitutional for the court, for the federal government to offer funding for Medicaid expansion, but not constitutional for it to restrict, to pull all the rest of Medicaid funding if a state decided not to participate. But what that means is that the major parts of the act are upheld. For those of you who don't know what this picture is, this is Obama holding up the CNN website saying that the mandate is struck down when they misreported it initially. But all the things that we have come to know and understand as a part of this act, they will all continue to go forward, and most of them in 2014, although some of them are effective now. So as far as the rest of this talk goes, what I want to do is just highlight four things pretty quickly for you. The first is that nearly all individuals will have to purchase health insurance starting in 2014, and we'll talk about how the case, if it all, changes the tenor of that. We'll talk about the Medicaid expansion opt-in, what's going to happen with some of the exchanges, and then future litigation and repeal efforts. So first and foremost, no broccoli horrible, right? Chief Justice Roberts' decision to uphold the mandate on the basis that the penalty for failure to comply with the mandate constitutes tax means that the deeply feared and much talked about government mandate to buy broccoli is not going to hold muster anymore. Justice Ginsburg called it the broccoli horrible repeatedly in the opinion. She's quite snarky as well to Justice Roberts at a few points in the opinion, which is great. So this will be forevermore deemed unconstitutional. So for those of you who are looking to beat obesity by forcing people to buy vegetables, it's not going to go forward. But all joking aside, I think that Roberts' opinion in holding this as a tax means that it changes the tenor of the mandate a little bit, and it draws people's attention pretty strongly to the idea that, well, yes, this is a mandate, but now it's a choice, right? You can buy health insurance, or you can choose to pay this penalty. And the penalty, the more people start to look at it, they might realize, well, that penalty really isn't that much money. It's a minimum of $95 per individual in 2014, or up to about 1% of income. It goes up to $295 in 2015, and then up to $695 at the minimum, and up to 2.5% of income. But for some people, that penalty might be significantly less than the cost of the lowest cost plan. As a result of this choice, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that about 4 million people that are currently uninsured are not going to buy health insurance. They're going to pay the penalty. And I think all the attention that has been drawn to this idea that it's a tax is going to make people more cognizant of this idea that they can bypass health insurance if they want to, if they just want to pay the penalty. The other thing that's been brought up sort of repeatedly is limited enforcement of this. The idea that, yes, it's a tax, but the IRS has limited ability to enforce it. They don't have the full panoply of options that they ordinarily have. They can't bring criminal penalties against it, and they can't levy. They can't put liens on your property for failure to pay it. They can increase the fines that you owe over time, but the more this gets talked about and touted, the more some people may decide that opting out is the way they want to go. So it doesn't really change anything with regards to the act, but it may change the way some people think about it. So let's talk now a little bit about the Medicaid expansion. As David mentioned, the court affirmed the expansion, but only in a limited way, such that states have the option to opt out. They can decide not to expand their Medicaid program to cover people up to 133% of the federal poverty level if they want to. And those are people who make about $30,000 a year for a family of 4, or about $15,000 a year for a family, for a couple, or for an individual, sorry. So this might have the ability to substantially cut into the 16 million people that currently were expected to get Medicaid under this expansion. And the court's reasoning for doing this was largely that the court felt that this was a real, not only a change in the degree of the Medicaid program, but a change in kind. And the reason that is because, or the reason that Justice Roberts said it was because historically Medicaid eligibility has been based on the idea that we want to cover not only the neediest people, not only the poorest, but the poorest within categories, right? The people who are the disabled, the blind, the elderly, and needy families with dependent children. But current Medicaid bills really don't cover that many childless adults. There's a lot of people who are left off our current Medicaid. And what he says is that the difference that this expansion makes is that it is part of a much larger, overarching program to provide universal health care. And therefore, that fundamentally changes the nature of the Medicaid program. And so therefore, because it's this massive change, it can't be considered as other expansions have been considered before. It's not that we've never expanded who is eligible for Medicaid before, but that this is such a fundamental expansion that it cannot be considered in the same way that it has previously. And so as a result of that, he felt that for a lot of states, Medicaid spending accounts about 20% of their overall state funding budget. The federal government contributes about 50% of Medicaid spending, 50 to 83%, depending on the state, which is a really substantial portion of state budgets for people. And the threat of withdrawing that for states that do not expand up to to cover Medicaid for 133, all people for 133% of the federal poverty level, is coercive. He went so far as to say it basically puts a gun to the head of these states. Now, those of you may be thinking, well, the ACA provides 100% of funding to cover these newly eligible individuals. It does for the first couple of years, but then as time goes on, it ratchets down to about 90%. Now, 90% is a lot higher percentage than the states are currently getting under their Medicaid program for the people they already cover, but it still would represent over time a significant amount of money for a number of states. And so what's interesting is to watch and see what people will do. What will the states do? Well, a lot of pundits have said, and I think that they are quite right, that states are going to be crazy to turn away federal money. They're going to be totally crazy. But in the initial response, we heard yesterday from Governor Scott Walker from Wisconsin, who said that he's not going to take any action on the bill with respect to Medicaid expansion or with respect to the exchanges until the elections in November, and he's hoping for a full repeal. Mississippi Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves stated that Mississippi taxpayers cannot afford the cost of the expansion, and so it was inclined to not drastically expand Medicaid. And Florida Governor Rick Scott said yesterday that the expansion would be devastating to the state's economy. Then this morning he was quoted in the New York Times saying, well, he'd have to think about it more because potentially there might be too much money to leave on the table. And I think that's what we're going to end up seeing, is that the vast majority of states are going to look at this and realize that it's so much money and that it's 100% starting forward, and that they're going to have a hard time justifying turning people down for health insurance if they only have to pay 90%. If you currently know that all states currently participate in the Medicaid program at different funding levels. But until that time, until we have all states participating, we have a really interesting conundrum with this bill. And the reality is that the couple here on your right, they will make, say they make $15,000 a year. They are below 100% of the federal poverty level. They will not be required by the mandate to have insurance because presumably the cost of the lowest price plan will exceed 8% of their income, probably exceed most of their income. But they're also not eligible for subsidies because they make less than 100% of the federal poverty level. The subsidies, the tax credits only start at 100% of the poverty level and go to 133. So at that point, they're not going to get any help. Whereas the couple here on this side of the screen, they might make $90,000 a year and have a family of 4. They're going to get help from the federal government to buy insurance. These guys aren't. And so it's an interesting loophole that they haven't really talked about much at this point. Now, there's a couple things the federal government can do. There's a small provision that exists in the bill that says resident aliens that don't qualify for Medicaid because they haven't been in the country for 5 years yet, if they make less than 100% of the federal poverty level, the government will treat them as meeting that standard in order to give them subsidies. So the federal government might put these people in that category and just say, well, we'll just treat you like you make 100% of the federal poverty level and we'll cover you. The problem with that strategy is that the federal government is then essentially saying to the states, if you don't cover them, we will. And we'll cover them at 100% and we'll do it going forward. Now, maybe if 2 or 3 states don't do that, that's what the federal government wants to do. But what's the incentive for the states to cover those people if they know the federal government's going to pick them up in the end? So it creates a little bit of a game of chicken between the states and the federal government about who's really going to cover these people now. Now, there may not be a lot of incentive for states to cover the poorest of the poor because they don't have a lot of political clout, but hospitals do. And what's going to happen to states is they're going to find out that their safety net hospitals are very upset about this, because this means that 16 million people who are supposed to get Medicaid are now not only not going to get Medicaid, but they're also much more likely to be uninsured, right? Because they don't get subsidies to pay for any of these bills either. And so if they don't have coverage, safety net hospitals are going to be exposed to people that have a lot greater uncompensated care. What has also happened in the ACA, though, is that disproportionate share hospital funding that goes to help fund these individuals and for uncompensated care has been cut because all these people are supposed to be on Medicaid. And so if that funding is drying up, all of a sudden, there's not a lot of funding, and this money to cover the uncompensated care for these individuals is going to end up being put back on the states. So what you might see is if hospitals can get this message out to the state legislatures, you should eventually, I think, see them start taking up Medicaid. But it'll be an interesting game to sort of watch of chicken between them. So let's briefly talk about, so this is just sort of where these individuals fall. They fall in here as far as not getting covered. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the exchanges. Another major issue for the health law is that the status of the exchanges in a lot of states. A lot of states have been sitting on their hands with the development of the exchanges and waiting to see what the outcome of this bill is. I think a lot of states were shocked at the opinion yesterday that everything got upheld. And so as a result, you've got a large number of states that have been waiting on planning. 27 states have been proceeding as though the law is going to go forward. About 5 of them have been waiting on the ruling. You've got 12 that have just halted all planning altogether, and you've got 6 that have made no significant start. All of these state exchanges have to present blueprints to the federal government about 10 days after the election in November, showing them what they're going to do with their exchange, and they have to have the full plan to them by January 1 so that the government can decide which exchanges are likely to go forward and which exchanges are not really going to make the cuts. But in order to do that, they've got to build IT systems, they've got to build a whole wealth of things in order to get that exchange off the ground. And because they've been sitting on their hands all this time, determined that this thing is going to get repealed, it's going to be a lot harder for those states to develop their own state exchange. If they can't develop their own state exchange, they're going to have a lot less power to tailor it to their needs, and their federal government will step in and run the exchange itself. So it'll be interesting to see which states try to scramble and get the exchanges going, and which states really wait for a repeal. So finally, is this the end of the fight? I don't think it is. I think that there are 4 strategies that are going to be likely to try and undermine the bill. One is wait till November and repeal and replace. You've heard that repeatedly over and over. The government might try to repeal certain portions of the bill, although when you look at a lot of the portions individually, there are huge portions of the bill that get a lot of bipartisan support, a lot of support from independents, and a lot of supports even from Republicans for a number of pieces of this bill. And so they may not be able to overturn things quite as easily on an individual piece-by-piece basis as people think. Finally, I heard some individuals talk about litigating the HHS regulations, and so you might see some fights in some cases come down about specific regulations. I don't think we'll see another wholesale litigation of the entire bill. And then finally, the fight might really come down at the congressional level at how are we going to appropriate different portions of this bill. A lot of the bill has not been appropriated fully yet, and so the fight may come to whether or not there is funding for a lot of the things that the bill wants to do and tries to do, or whether that funding is really minimal at a level that it allows it to not be effective. Okay, so those are the points that I wanted to make. In the end, thank you so much. If you are interested in these topics and the relevance of health law and intersection of health law and policy, please come to more consortium events in the future.